Do you know, she's such a lovely dancer, that Eileen McMahon, isn't she? Have you seen her? She's whirling across that dance floor with the happiness shining from her face. Oh, she could dance with anyone she wants to, couldn't she? She could have the pick of the island. And they were right, you know, she could have the pick of the island. And she did dance with them all, one by one by one. But who wouldn't want to dance with her? She shone with happiness when she danced. She was a lovely girl as well. Not only did she dance as light as a feather, but she was a kind girl. She looked after her mum and the children. She was a good one. And so she did dance with them all, one by one by one, until she danced with just one man. Oh. The first time that Frankie asked her to dance, he put his hand out and she put her hand into his, and they just fitted together like the dovetails in a joint. And it was such a shock. They looked at each other and they held each other's gaze for just that little bit too long. You know what it's like when you meet someone you really quite like and you figure out that they actually like you too. And it was magic. And he took her to dance. And together they made their way around the dance floor, and it was as if, and I'm going to sound really corny now, it was as if the rest of the world disappeared. And so began their courtship, and they danced together week after week, every weekend at the village hall on the island. And even when they weren't dancing together, she knew exactly where he was in the room without having to look. And when she did look, he caught her eye and there was a twinkle in his eye just for her. And when they were Kayleys, they couldn't dance together all night in a Kaylee, but when they came together, you could see the sparks as their hands touched. And so it came as no surprise, but a source of enormous delight for everyone on the island when the banns were read and a date was set for their wedding. And oh, what a wedding it was. The island had never seen anything like it. It was a grand old party, and it went on until the dawn faded the stars from the sky. And so began their married life, and it was a life of happy contentment. Frankie was a fisherman, and he would go out every day on his little boat, and Eileen would get on with all those jobs that we all have to do when nobody notices, and she would wait for him coming back. And she'd go down to the seashore in the afternoon when the tide came in, and she'd stand and wait for him, and she'd see his little boat coming back over the horizon. And when it up onto the beach, he would jump out and he would pick her up and he would swing around, and they'd prepare the catch together. And then they'd spend the evening together, just companionable. They would walk along the shore and they would talk of their dreams for the future. Perhaps children. And they were very, very happy together until one afternoon, one particularly squally, windy, wild afternoon, Eileen was down by the shore waiting for Frankie to come back, and she waited and waited, and she pulled her shawl tight around herself, and she waited longer and longer, and he just didn't return. And she walked up the hill a little bit so she could see further out towards that horizon, because she was sure he would be back any minute. And she waited all night and he wasn't back. And the following morning, the whole island was out searching for Frankie, and they made their way around the shores of that small island. But it was her that found him. Well, it had to be, didn't it? There he was. Those blue eyes that held that twinkle just for her, they were staring straight up at the heavens now. And those warm hands, those warm, rough hands that had fitted so closely with hers, she held them against her face and they were cold. He had seaweed tangled in his beard and his hair. And if you'd been there, I think you probably would have heard the crack as Eileen's heart broke. Well, before long, he was buried with his feet facing out to sea, up on the hill. And she tried to carry on. She carried on helping her family and her friends, and she carried on. She went to the dances even, and people would ask her to dance, and then they stopped asking her to dance, and she was just a sad space in the room. She was broken. And every evening she would walk along the shore and she would just look out at that horizon just because she had to. And she grew thin and wan. And this carried on as the circle of the wheel turned and the nights got darker and the days got shorter. And she would go and walk every evening along the shore with a shawl wrapped tightly around her, gazing out to sea. And she knew she couldn't go on much longer. But she was waiting. She was waiting for that special night in the year, deep towards the winter. And she knew it was the night when all the dead of the island had their own dance. And sure enough, she sat there that night and she watched the stars wheel across the sky and she listened. And then she heard it. She heard the sound of a fiddle and a flute. And she stood up and she walked until she could hear that music more clearly. And she gazed down into the valley, and there they all were, all the dead of the island. And they were there as pale as moonlight. And they were dancing. They had a ceilidh and they were having a whale of a time. All of them, except Frankie. And Frankie stood right on the edge of the group. And he had no partner. Well, she ran down that hill towards him and she flung herself into his arms and he picked her up and he twirled around and he said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Frankie, I've come to dance." And he laughed and he took her into his arms and they began to dance. And it was as if the rest of the world had faded away. And the music came to an end and he pushed her away and he said, "Eileen, you know how much I love you, but this is not the place for you. You need to go home." And she said, oh, Frankie, go on, just one more dance." And off they went again. And they fitted together like the dovetails of a joint. And when that music finished, he really did push her away and he said, "Enough now. This is not the place for you." And she said, "Frankie, my place is with you." Oh, I couldn't resist. And they danced and they danced and they danced until the dawn came and the stars faded. And as the stars faded away, so did the ghosts. Well, she made her way home. She went back to her mother's house and her dress was wet with the dew and her hair was soaked with the sea mist, and she threw herself onto a bed and she lay there as white as a ghost all day. And the doctor was called. And then the wise woman was called, but it was no use. And in the evening, she perked up a bit and they could see she was listening to music that no one else could hear. And by the morning she was gone. And although Eileen has been coffined now and is buried on the hillside with her feet facing out to sea next to her beloved Frankie, when the islanders talk about her, they don't say she's died. They say she's off dancing with Frankie again, because she always did love dancing with Frankie.